It really hasn't been happening in the last year. It's been happening since about a month after I took office. From the time I took office, I began to get threats. Those threats come in the way of emails. Those threats come in the way of phone calls, text messages, any which way you can imagine. At some point, the threats became where I had to leave my home. And I've been out of my home since the first year in office.
It's life in Trump's America. She's not alone. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, Judge Juan Merchan, Jack Smith, special counsel, they've all faced attacks because they have made an effort. They have sought to hold Donald Trump accountable in the same way any of us would be held accountable. But someone who has not been the subject of the ex-president's wrath, at least publicly, Judge Aileen Cannon. She's overseen the classified documents cased against him. That may be because Judge Cannon has, from the outside, seemingly done as much as she can do to imperil what once seemed to be, according to former Trump Attorney General Bill Barr, the most straightforward, open and shut, guilty as can be in the eyes of people who know these sorts of things, prosecution of Donald J. Trump. As we reported on the program yesterday, Judge Cannon took an unusual step of striking a paragraph from special counsel Jack Smith's indictment of Trump. It referred to Trump sharing classified information. That was on the heels of her decision to schedule a number of hearings on some questionable motions later this month, further adding to the backlog, very real backlog of unresolved issues in this case. Joining our conversation, MSNBC legal analyst, the co-host of the Prosecuting Donald Trump podcast, Andrew Weissman's here. Andrew, I know you've got a specific thing that you think she may have messed up, but just give me the bigger picture. What's going on here?
Well, Nicole, there's no good news because the big picture of the Mar-a-Lago case is that she has done what I think she intended to do, which is to make sure that this case would not see a jury before the election, something that Juan Merchan has made sure would happen. But Donald Trump obviously does not want to see any of these cases. For somebody who says this is a witch hunt and he's innocent, he doesn't want to have a jury, in fact, hear the evidence, and she is making sure that that is not going to happen. So even if she ultimately gets pulled off the case by the 11th Circuit, the Court of Appeals that oversees her, it's now too late. There's just no way for an appellate court to rule on that and to have someone come in. And so she succeeded in what I totally agree with you is the most straightforward case, and one that is endangering all of our national security. It could not be more serious.
What is the evidence that makes clear that what it feels like and looks like from the outside is what's happening, that she seems to, at every point, do the thing that most helps Donald Trump?
You know, it's big and small. You want big examples? Big examples are that she was reversed at the outset of the case, not once, but twice by the 11th Circuit. And that's a very conservative 11th Circuit. That is a conservative Court of Appeals. And it's because her rulings were not just legally wrong, but they're legally wrong for Donald Trump. It's not that she makes legal errors, for the government. But then there are small ways in which Donald Trump will essentially mislead her about trial dates and what he's doing in other courts. And when it's brought to the court's attention, she yells at the government for how they brought it to her attention. They seek last-minute extensions, and she, of course, grants it without sort of giving the same kind of sort of bench slapping that she gives to the government for every minor foot fault. Even when there wasn't a foot fault. And so, it really comes down to big and small. She is making errors, and they're all one way. And so I think that's the reason that it's really impossible, where I really tried to give her the benefit of the doubt when the indictment was brought and thought maybe after 2 reversals by the 11th Circuit, she would sort of honor her oath. And I just don't think there's any evidence of that.
Well, and I guess watching it from the outside, it feels like this was apparent so early when, as you just said, this very conservative circuit overruled her, when Judge Dearie was involved at some point because she had to send things to another jurisdiction because she didn't think it was fair to look at all of the things that were seized along with the classified documents. I mean, it feels like there were so many markers early on that I wonder if you think that Jack Smith will look back and, I mean, did he have a choice? Was there another place he could have brought any of these charges?
Well, hindsight's 2020. It is easy to look back and say that he should have moved to recuse her earlier and not given her the benefit of the doubt. But understanding the law to remove a judge is and should be very difficult. You can't just not like a judge's ruling and then say, I want a new judge. On terms of venue, I actually think he also did the right thing. I mean, this is where, you see an example of President Biden playing it straight with respect to the rule of law. And that is what Jack Smith did, which is that there was no place where all of the charges could naturally be brought. It would have looked like real forum shopping. And he played it straight. He brought it where all of the charges could be brought. He understood there was at least a 1 in 3 chance that he would get Judge Cannon, and he did. And you sort of hope that people will take their oaths of office seriously. And then the latest is, she sort of weighed in on an issue that was before Judge Merchan about unanimity, and she again sort of gratuitously ruled against the government in a way that I think was going to come back to haunt her.
My sense in covering the fantastic coverage of the Supreme Court is that it's always worse than what ProPublica is able to publish based on documents and undeniable facts they're able to reveal. So I guess, of course, Alito singles them out and trashes them, but it's really haunting.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you have a justice of the Supreme Court who is essentially blaming the media. Let me point out that the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution envisions both a free press and a press that is essential to a functioning democracy. So it's a little chilling to hear a justice on the Supreme Court sort of lament the role that the media is doing in reporting, as you point out, things that turn out to be entirely true. And I think that it's also important to keep in mind that there are sort of 3 parts to what the justice said. The first is a lamenting that things that were private were made public. The second is really the underlying question that I hope people keep their eye on the ball on, which is, why are justices accepting these gifts? I mean, there are lawyers all around Washington, D.C. that advise people in the executive branch and in Congress whether they can stand up or sit down when they eat certain food, whether they are allowed to accept a baseball ticket if they sit in one section or another. And yet the justices seem to, operate under an entirely different sensibility of what kind of gifts they can receive. But finally, and the authors of the book on Roe, I think, can speak to this. We are awaiting very, very important decisions from the Supreme Court. And those decisions will affect the future of our democracy, whether Donald Trump will have complete immunity, whether women and other groups will have fundamental rights. And just the temperament that came through on those tapes from Justice Alito are not what you would expect from a justice. I would contrast it with what you heard the Chief Justice, who I oftentimes disagree with, but his temperament on those conversations was very appropriate. And so we shouldn't lose sight of what it means for the litigants before them when you have a justice who speaks this way in private.
Lisa, there is a long history of Republican, and I guess Democratic, but I worked on Republican campaigns, complaints about the media. But it has never included the money that a news organization spent to reveal something that was absolutely true. And that's really sort of the nut graph of Alito's indictment of ProPublica, that they, quote, spent a fortune investigating Clarence Thomas, stories that were so accurate. Not only did they win a Pulitzer, but Clarence Thomas most recently discloses the gifts that ProPublica first told we, the people, about. Alito is one of 9 people who sit in this body, the Supreme Court, one of 9 people in charge of upholding the rule of law and the Constitution in our country, and his open disdain for the, quote, fortune spent by ProPublica investigating Clarence Thomas. Not something that turned out to be untrue, not something that wouldn't have been disclosed if he were a judge on any other bench, on any other body, any other court in the land. But just the gripe, just the indignation that happened is extraordinary.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary. Look, investigating public officials is what we as independent journalists do. But I think it's something that's a little bit foreign to the court. Part of what we show in our book, The Fall of Roe, is how the decision in Dobbs, which of course is the case that ended Roe as a precedent, really helped shift public opinion about the court and help the public see the court more as a political body than what the court is supposed to be and what they consider themselves to be, which is this temple of judicial, impartiality. So I think part of what happened after that decision is the court was brought down to the same level as these other bodies in Washington, Congress, the White House, and they started getting the same treatment from the media as politicians get, which they were investigated. They were, their histories were investigated, their personal lives were investigated, their conflicts of interest was investigated. Maybe that's work that should have been done in this more fulsome way before the decision in Dobbs, but it's certainly happening now. And I think it is part of the shift in public opinion about the court since that decision.
Alex, let me show you something that Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said in that interview we started with. She's standing next to Jamie Raskin there on All In with my colleague Chris Hayes last night.
But to have any one of our co-equal branches be completely unaccountable to the others is paving the path to authoritarianism, tyranny, the abuse of power in the United States. And it is structurally completely unsustainable. And so it is not a question of if Congress has jurisdiction and power over the Supreme Court. It is what power are we going to exercise in order to rein in a fundamentally unaccountable and rogue court.
Alex, it strikes me that she is one of the first people asking the more accurate question. What do you think of that?
Representative Ocasio-Cortez is absolutely right. It falls to Congress to take this challenge seriously. I think Americans across the political spectrum are seeing this crisis of corruption at our court and recognizing that things are out of kilter. This is not how it's supposed to be. And as Representative Raskin said in the introductory remarks, it cannot be that the court can police itself here, that they can be the jury for their own trial. And we have seen just how badly that has worked throughout this past year of devastating scandals across this branch. From Clarence Thomas, we recently learned receiving upwards of $5 million from billionaires who have interests directly before him, and now Justice Alito flying these two MAGA war banners outside of his house, one a symbol of the January 6th insurrection, and the other a symbol of the Christian nationalist theocratic project that he was very much installed on the Supreme Court to achieve. And so now we're in this position of significant democratic crisis, very much because of the Supreme Court. Its rulings, ruling for these very billionaires. We can expect more devastating rulings to limit the ability of government to protect our clean air and water. And of course, the attacks on women's freedoms, and particularly the Dobbs decision that, I think that flag so powerfully represents.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Alex, in your meetings with Congress, are you optimistic that they are going to use the tools at their disposal? In their public interviews on this show, at least, they've not projected much confidence that they have the ability to do much of anything.
You're right. I think the Senate in particular, which has traditionally been the branch of Congress, the House with the advice and consent power to confirm judges, does not see much of a path forward here because of Republican obstruction on common sense questions of ethics and reform, questions that used to be matters of consensus, bipartisan agreement, things that people across the political spectrum, against independents and Republicans alike, feel like must be taken seriously. And now that bipartisan support for these ideas is long gone. And because of the constraints that the Senate is under, particularly the need to confirm lower court judges, they don't see a path forward to actually enforce some of the subpoenas and pursue the oversight that they so desperately need to pursue. But there is a lot that they can do. They can hold hearings. We've seen from Justice Alito's neighbor who he implicated in one of these flag-waving scandals, that she has asserted that he is not telling the truth about the timeline of events. That is something that the Senate could very much take up and look at. And over on the House side, I think we are starting to see this energy, a real understanding of Congress's role to take this seriously, all of the powers and tools that the Congress does actually have to protect the American people from this authoritarian court.
Elizabeth, you guys write about this sort of Christian movement, the godliness, but I want to play what Lauren Windsor, the activist, says to elicit the full-throated endorsement of that idea on these undercover tapes for you first.
I think that the solution really is like winning the moral argument. Like, people in this country who believe in God have got to keep fighting for that, to return our country to a place of godliness.
Oh, I agree with you. I agree with you.
So, Elizabeth, I'm old enough to remember when just that I agree with you, I agree with you would be a scandal in and of itself. It gets much worse. You and Lisa write this. The core of the idea expressed to Mr. Alito that the country must fight the decline of Christianity in public life goes beyond the questions of bias and influence at the nation's highest court. An array of conservatives, including anti-abortion activists, church leaders, and conservative state legislators, has openly embraced the idea that American democracy needs to be grounded in Christian values and guarded against the rise of secular culture. They are right-wing Catholics and evangelicals who oppose abortion, same-sex marriage, transgender rights, and what they see as the dominance of liberal views in school curriculums. And they've become a crucial segment of former President Trump's political coalition, intermingled with the MAGA movement that boosted him to the White House and that hopes to do so once again in November. The only thing I'd add to that perfect articulation of where we are is, and they're going to decide whether or not Donald Trump has, quote, absolute immunity in the criminal cases and charges against him.
Well, this idea of returning America to a place of, quote, godliness, this is not language that I think many Americans might be familiar with or thinking would be a legal principle, right? So it's indicative of the entirely new moment that this country is in, especially since the overturning of Roe. I mean, our book, The Fall of Roe, the subtitle is The Rise of a New America. And it gets at these questions about what is this conservative Christian movement that was so powerful that so many people didn't see that led to the overturning of Roe? Where are they going next, right? And what Alito, by talking about godliness, was playing into was the language of this entirely, this right-wing conservative Christian movement that really, as we show in our book, thinks about the questions of democracy in an overarching question, not question, but an overarching story of being within the kingdom of God. For many of these Christians, democracy, the story of America, is just a small story in the broader story of the kingdom of Jesus. And putting that language in the court, we guess we can talk about financial gifts and like what that means, that kind of influence. But this question of religious influence in the court, especially conservative Christian influence, this is the frontier of all these kinds of cases that we're seeing and what's really at stake that I think Americans need to understand. So understanding the history of how Roe fell through our book, that's a way to understand what is this rise of this new America and what is the role of conservative right-wing Christianity.
Mark Elias, if we'd understand. This news just breaking on Capitol Hill. The GOP-led House of Representatives has just voted to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress for refusing to hand over audio tapes of Special Counsel Robert Hur's interview with President Joe Biden in his investigation over President Biden's handling of classified documents. The House is in possession of that transcript and has been for a long time. Andrew Weissman, it feels like every day we have a new chapter or a new piece of evidence in the perversion of the rule of law, the opposite of what you just described Jack Smith and Joe Biden doing in terms of playing it straight, and this all-out assault on the rule of law from the right.
I'm going to borrow a phrase from President Barack Obama when, we are in the midst of silly season. We have not seen a lot of adult supervision in the House. And the idea that impeachments are now being handed out as retaliation as opposed to reserving that for the most egregious conduct is another sign of the way in which Donald Trump and his enablers have really debased Washington and institutions that I know you and I, Nicole, absolutely revere. And so it's very, very painful to see that denigration. There's nothing that Merrick Garland has done that warrants this. They have the transcript. The reason for the audio tape would be solely to see if they could make political hay out of it. That is not the role of the Department of Justice. And this is not something that they traditionally do. And so they're adhering to that norm, which is something that they should be doing, which is adhering to what they would do regardless of whether it would help or hurt the sitting president, whether it would help or hurt a Republican or a Democrat. And you cannot think of a better time for Merrick Garland to be making that point when he has been the Attorney General overseeing an investigation of the sitting president, overseeing and appointing a special counsel for a prosecution, a successful one, of the president's son, and one that is going to come up, a second one for the president's son in September, and ongoing cases against a sitting Democratic senator. It is just impossible to think that he is playing politics, or if he were, he's doing it awfully badly.
Inspired in large part by our conversation with my friend and colleague Rachel Maddow about how we cover this moment, this now convicted ex-president, current president, this extraordinary moment. We have a story for you. It starts like this: shot and chaser. At a time when the ex-president, now convicted felons, rantings and ravings about things like sharks and electric boats and whether he'd go with electrocution or getting eaten by the shark, have everybody, regardless of political persuasion, talking about his state of mind. At that moment, a merchant of right-wing talking points and sometimes even disinformation is going into overdrive with calculated and relentless regional attacks on President Joe Biden. Statements by Donald Trump, on the other hand, so unhinged. Fox News didn't carry them or broadcast them, didn't go back and air them after the fact either. In the words of Stephen King, that speech was, quote, like listening to your senile uncle at the dinner table after he has that third drink. So that performance and others like it are reviving real questions about Trump's stability, his mental acuity, questions Trump loves to talk about. He's in on this conversation and has been for years. Watch.
The next day they'll say, he's crazy. The next day they'll say, oh, he's incompetent. The next day they'll say, this is one of the dumbest human beings ever. And that wasn't working, but I didn't like that one as much. I mean, that was bad. So I asked Doc Ronnie. I said, what do you think about a cognitive test, Ronnie? Then he said, sir, there is a test. It's called the X test. Then you get to the end questions, and very few people could answer those questions. A chair, a hat, a badge, a necklace. Like a giraffe, a tiger, or this, or that. A whale. Which one is the whale? Person, woman, man, camera, TV. They say, that's amazing. How did you do that? I aced it twice. I aced it, and I aced it. I aced both of them. Aced it. I aced it. Every question right.
Most of us are wondering who said that's amazing, right? But there's more. Now for the chaser. Over the last week in this country, local news stations owned by the Sinclair Broadcast Group, which actually controls nearly 200 local TV outlets all across the country, millions of viewers, probably lots of all of our neighbors. So those stations have been airing a story, a TV package, with nearly the exact same script about reporting from the Wall Street Journal that was highly criticized for being highly critical about President Joe Biden's mental acuity.
The Wall Street Journal calling into question.
The Wall Street Journal has published a story. The Wall Street Journal is out with new reporting.
Calling into question the mental fitness of President Joe Biden.
Calling into question the mental fitness of President Biden.
President Joe Biden's mental fitness being questioned once again.
As national correspondent Matt Galka tells us, the issue could be an election decider. As national correspondent Matt Gelka tells us, the issue could be an election decider.
As national correspondent Matt Gelka tells us, the issue could be an election decider.
But could it be an election decider? Here's Matt Gelka with a story for us.
So the only difference in the scripts, right, was whether there's a question mark after could it be an election decider question. It could be an election decider, right? Identical scripts pushed out to local news stations. Now, those broadcasts first caught the attention of the newsletters Popular Information and Public Notice. The segments are talking about what they have sort of regurgitated is a piece of reporting in the Wall Street Journal. And in that story, there's reporting that goes like this. Basically, behind closed doors, President Joe Biden was showing signs of slipping. Now, the only person quoted on the record in that story is former Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who, after his dealings with Joe Biden, actually described President Joe Biden as, quote, sharp and capable. The piece faced blowback from Democrats, people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, who had offered their accounts of President Joe Biden behind the scenes to the Wall Street Journal. But their quotes and their characterizations of the president did not make it into the final edited version of the story. The New Republic reports this, quote, "It is not the first time Sinclair, owned by right-wing businessman David Smith, has appeared to be running a conservative propaganda campaign. Infamously, in 2018, dozens of the company's TV stations were caught airing an identical editorial about the dangers of biased and false news." Here's what that looked like.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about troubling and irresponsible one-sided news stories playing in our country.
Who needs state TV, right? It is different from Fox. So different. It's a different story. It's a newscast that gets you when you're open, right? When you're watching your local newscast, when you're taking in information about the weather and the local parades, the local holidays, local figures. But our question today, is it a right-wing disinformation operation disguised as one of the most trusted sources of information and news as we head into the 2024 presidential campaign? It's where we start. President of Media Matters for America, Angela Karsine, is here. Plus, MSNBC contributor and columnist Charlie Sykes is here. With us at the table, the host of the On Brand podcast, Donnie Deutsch, is here. And New York Times editorial board member, MSNBC political analyst Mara Gay is here. So, Donnie, we're just trying to, eyes wide open, right? As we head into this, I've tried to peek over at Fox News. I turned it on when Trump was convicted. I turned it on when Hunter Biden was convicted. And I use it to sort of understand the right wing, the depths of right wing detachment from reality. This is different. This is softer and probably more effective. And there's nothing illegal about it. But it's just an important thing, I think, to have on the radar. I hope it's something that the Biden campaign has on the radar as we head into really sort of the meat of the general election conversation.
Here's what we've got to come to terms with. Life and the media are not fair, and they're getting less and less fair, and things are frightening. You have Wall Street Journal running a horribly sourced piece saying that Biden is unfit, and then you've got these local news people, as you said, more insidiously reading a script about it. And you know what the answer is? A 90-minute debate for Joe Biden. The answer is he's got to answer the bell. The Democrats have not done themselves, and I'm just going to call it like it is, have not done themselves a favor by not having him out there as much as he should be. And this all gets answered. The media is a problem. It's disgusting. It's reprehensible. But we can wring our hands about it, or we can get behind a candidate. And that candidate is hopefully, and I believe he will, is going to show up and answer the question. The other candidate, who comes off like a blithering idiot, hopefully will answer the bell in a different way and show that he's a blithering idiot. We can talk to a blue in the face. It's not fair. The media is unfair. It's getting worse and worse and worse. This is the devil in a lot of ways. Joe Biden's got to answer the bell 2 weeks from tomorrow.
I mean, what do you make? I asked Rachel this question yesterday. What do you make of the fact that Fox isn't carrying Trump's speeches?
It's state TV. We know why. But by the way, and it's the same reason I sat on the show a couple of weeks ago and said, let's end this trial so we can get him back out there. The other thing that is kind of ridiculous, that where Trump gets a mulligan that Biden doesn't get. I was having a lunch with somebody right after the weekend when Trump was going, and I was just talking about the speech to a friend of mine who's kind of a swing voter. Trump went to Biden, probably go back to Trump now. And he goes, yeah, but he's really funny. That's what he said to me. He gets these bizarre style points that people overlook the babbling insanity of what he's saying because there is an entertainment value. And that's a problem. That's real. It's not fair. It's where he gets points for that, where Biden doesn't have that. Biden is stately and he comes with gravitas, but he's not entertaining. And he literally, this very educated man, sat there and said to me, yeah, but he's funny. I said, but he's incoherent. Yeah, he's a little crazy, but he's funny. So it's not fair. The stakes are high. The world is not a fair place. Media is grotesque right now. And Democrats have just got to punch in the face and answer the bell. And Joe Biden has to answer the bell.
Angela, I mispronounced your last name. I apologize. Angela Carson is here. Jump in on how we can do a better job in this cycle. This is Trump's third run. What are we still getting wrong?
So a couple of things. One, I agree the media is not fair. We should accept that, and we shouldn't hand-wring. I do think, though, as you noted in your monologue, what Sinclair is doing is particularly insidious, and that won't just be resolved by Joe Biden being out there more often, because you have sort of a right-wing propaganda operation that is willing to go even further than Fox News. That they've done that in the past, and they're doing it under the imprimatur of a lot of banners, trusted sources, CBS, NBC, ABC. That's the way these affiliate works. So be realistic about the landscape. That doesn't mean we should wring our hands about it. But to your question, we should be realistic. And that then gets into the bigger thing of how do you deal with a guy like Donald Trump? And I do think, as somebody that has watched, just wild to say, 612 Donald Trump speeches since the 2016 election, they're not the same as they were in 2016. Yeah. They're not the same as they were in 2020. And my honest hunch is that most of the media, most of the reporters and people talking about him, covering him, have not watched a full speech in years. And the reason it's important and significant is because they'll see just how much he's declined. There may have been entertainment value in Trump in the past. There's not much entertainment value in his speeches right now. There's not new, fresh material. He doesn't have as much inputs as he has. It's revanchism, it's frustration, it's anger, it's confusion, but it doesn't have the same engagement. And that gets to the point that you raised earlier. It's part of the reason why Fox News isn't covering it, because it's not as good for their business as it once was. It's not the ratings draw that it once was, because they're not as entertaining. So I think, to put a bow, if we're going to cover this honestly, we need the people covering it to actually force themselves to sit through a full speech just to get a sense of how much it changed. Because the downstream effects of that is you would not see as much hand-wringing in mainstream media and mainstream reporting about the discrepancies between Joe Biden and Donald Trump's, mental acuity once somebody actually saw what the current state of Donald Trump really is. Not the few snippets of him yelling as he's walking into a room or a courtroom, but actually how he speaks for a full hour. And I think what Donnie said earlier is exactly on point. That debate could be a real pivot point, because it's going to actually force a lot of people that actually have not tuned in for a long time, even though they should be, to just get a sense of just how bad it's actually gotten. That, to me, feels like the first step.